Alright everyone, out of respect for the competitors, if all spectators would take a moment to silence your cell phones. Also, if you'd like to talk about the round during the round, then you can leave now. We don't want to distract them.
This guy's ready. I got paper from him too.
Okay.
I wrote the coin flip on the back of those pages, just letting you know. I realize that now.
I'll deal with it. Alright. Okay. Tony's ready.
Yeah.
All three judges.
1 second.
Cool. Alright, let's begin. Acton Boxborough affirms the resolution in contention 1 is refugees. Spain is currently dragging its feet on fulfilling its commitment to housing refugees. Wilson of the Independent explains that while 17,000 refugees were planned to be relocated to Spain, the Spanish government has only accepted 6% of them. Hoffman of Vice explains that continual political resistance has prevented the Spanish government from taking in more refugees. Problematically, Hoffman continues that the only entity legally capable of authorizing the intake of refugees in the status quo is the Spanish federal government. However, granting Catalonia independence would provide refugees on the border with a new home. Unlike the Spanish government, Catalonia is ideologically committed to helping refugees. Barton of NYU finds that almost 1 million Catalan residents are descendants of refugees from Madrid or other European provinces. In this vein, Palmer of the University of Barcelona explains that Catalonia's refugee history is present in the memories of both older and younger generations. For this reason, Palmer explains that the Catalan government is ready to take in refugees as soon as they are given the opportunity to do so. Bellware of the Huffington Post corroborates that there is a consensus among Catalans that the government should accept substantially more refugees. As such, according to the Tansim news agency, Catalan politicians have explicitly stated that more refugees would be taken in if Catalonia were to gain independence. Already, the Al Monitor reports that Catalonia has the public services and infrastructure ready to house refugees. Hoffman furthers that Catalonia can use municipal funds for refugee provisions like social and housing programs. Put simply, an independent Catalonia would be free from the constraints that hamper the Spanish government's ability to accept refugees. The impact is preventing mass suffering. For a refugee, the alternative to relocation is staying in refugee camps. Because refugee camps are consistently under-resourced and located in conflict zones, Smith of the USCRI explains that refugees are typically housed in the most desolate and dangerous settings. For this reason, Malmström of the European Commission finds that resettlement can mean the difference between life and death for these refugees. Contention 2 is preventing conflict escalation. Compromise is not on the horizon. As pro-unity demonstrators and pro-independence separatists come to a head, Jones of The Guardian explains that current tensions between Catalonia and Spain are at an all-time high. Wildman of Vox explains that this has left Catalonia in a state of political and economic instability. Problematically, Kingsley of the New York Times explains that failure for Catalonia and Spain to reach a viable solution will only embolden radical separatists in other countries who will believe that the peaceful negotiations with the host state are fruitless. In this vein, Catalonia and Spain will continue to escalate for 2 reasons. The first is radical parties. According to Buck of the Financial Times, without support of smaller, more radical groups, separatists do not have a majority in Catalonia's majority party. This gives these radical groups undue leverage over the independence movement, which they use to push for a more hardline and confrontational approach. Second is a domestic crackdown. In an attempt to stop Catalan independence, Guyon of The Guardian reports that the Spanish government has reacted with aggression. This ensures escalation, as Balcells of Duke find that self-determination movements empirically respond to repressive actions by the host state with violence. Indeed, Ottens of the Foreign Policy Research Institute explains that the curtailing of Catalan autonomy has only radicalized the movement for independence. For these two reasons, Saez of DW explains that the Catalan secessionist movement and the Spanish anti-independence movement are now ideologically irreconcilable. Without a solution, Roller of the London School of Economics explains that the conflict will only escalate further. Already, Newton of Al Jazeera reports that there has been a recent upsurge in violence from Spanish nationalists against Catalan independence supporters. Fortunately, affirming ends this cycle. Fernando Betancourt explains that recognizing Catalan independence would kickstart negotiations over issues such as debt, property, and social services, allowing for a gradual secession process. Indeed, Hedgecoe of the Irish Times explains that if Spain were to recognize Catalan independence, it would be part of an amicable agreement in which EU rights are maintained. Overall, Carana of the Leiden University writes that the process of bilateral secession generally concludes on peaceful terms. Thus, we affirm.
Can I see your card on infrastructure?
Sure.
That, and also the card that specifically says post-secession they'll take a bunch of refugees. There's like Chelsea News Agency.
Sure.
Yeah.
People?
No, I don't know.
This is the first part about them having the infrastructure ready, and if you scroll down a little bit, I can show you later if you want to see it. It talks about what it is specifically.
Okay, cool. That's one. And then what's the other one?
10 signature. Top card. One card.
Okay. Cool.
10 seconds. Okay. We're gonna continue.
No.
Oh, I have to use this. Everyone's good? Alright. To Vashon negate, our first contention is about hurting Spain's economy. This happens in two ways. First, revenue. Codesova of CNN Money explains that a fifth of Spanish tax revenue is supported by Catalonia, one of the richest regions in Spain. Much like any progressive tax system, Catalonia's share is crucial to ensuring the stability of the sorry, poor and working class via direct governmental assistance and social programs. Second, investment. Al Jazeera in 2017 writes that Catalonia is home to the largest station businesses of Spain, with 25% of all goods and services produced in Catalonia. Because of this, Catalonia is the largest regional draw of foreign direct investment. Overall, Rodrigo Pose of the LSE concludes that affirming would cost Spain 20% of its GDP overnight, and the loss of this value will collapse exports and consumer confidence. Our second contention is about freezing over. Affirming would lead to the international isolation of Catalonia. As Ashish Kumar of the Atlantic Council in 2017 explains, an independent Catalonia would by definition no longer be part of the EU, and would see barriers go up between it and EU member states overnight. The implication of this would be no free movement for people with Catalan passports, no free movement of goods and services to and from Catalonia, and a potential loss of access to the euro. Alfonso Valero of the Conservation furthers that because joining the EU requires a unanimous yes vote, it is all but certain that even if Catalonia attempted to rejoin, it would face rejection. This is because Sarah Williams of Vox in 2017 explains, an independent Catalonia would set the dangerous precedent for secessionist movements everywhere to challenge EU states. So rejecting Catalonia would be necessary to uphold the structural integrity of the EU and show consequences for future challenges to power. However, even if Catalonia were to bypass these hurdles somehow, the BBC reports that historically the process of EU integration would take a minimum of 10 years. And within this decade, Catalonia will be left in a state of complete uncertainty, laying the undeniable foundation for a failed economy. Sophia Bosch of CNBC explained that in the event of independence, Catalonia's separation from the EU would guarantee a loss of 2/3 of their exports and 70% of all foreign direct investment, leading analysts to project that unemployment would double on impact. Importantly, the loss of access to the European central bank and Spanish debt relief would indefinitely delay Catalonia's ability to recover, as it could not invest in the creation of important state apparatuses like a federal banking system and improved infrastructure, locking in economic and political instability. As such, the immediate consequence of affirming is a scathing recession felt most directly by those at the bottom. Posit concludes that the independence translates into a period of, quote, rapid impoverishment from which Catalonia may never recover. Our third and final contention is about international fracturing. Press News in 2017 explains that the Catalan independence movement risks a spillover effect onto neighboring countries. Spain officially granting Catalonia independence would break many clearly drawn lines in its constitution with severe implications. Rachel Donadio of The Atlantic reports that following Catalonian independence, secessionist movements in Italy, Belgium, and France may rapidly move to secede, claiming Spain's example as precedent. Already, Al Jazeera reports in 2017 that Catalonia's fight for independence has intensified conflict in other Spanish regions. The best example of this is with the current Basque movement. Holly Elliott in CNBC in 2017 writes that the Basque country also claims its status as an autonomous country and is closely eyeing the situation unfold in Catalonia. The situation is uniquely unstable because of the region's history of violent separatism and terrorist attacks carried out by a nationalist group, and the top spokesman for the Basque National Party has recently made moves to indicate a resurgence of an independent movement based on the likes of Catalonia. The impact is a snowballing effect of instability. Sternsick of Vox EU writes in a comprehensive analysis that any secessionist movement of a small state from a larger one inspired out of conflict is likely to collapse the smaller state's economy. But even if there's an absence of a full secession, Bloomberg writes that the political turmoil and conflict across multiple areas of Spain and beyond could spell the downfall of the euro and its accompanying markets. Thus, winning good.
Are you good, Sean?
Yeah, I'm good.
Alright, that's the first question.
Yep.
Alright. Is a Catalonian economic downturn good for Spain?
A Catalan economic downturn?
Is it good for Spain?
Probably not.
Okay.
Where are you going with the question? What's the point of that?
I would argue that like your entire case is very, very contingent on this idea that like a transition towards an independent Catalonia would be like very, very sudden and would have like devastating impacts, correct?
Not necessarily like super sudden. Like it could take 10 years to get them into the EU.
I would argue
Depends
that
on
they
what
could
part of
get
the
into
secession you're
I
talking
would
about.
argue that they could get into the EU right away.
Why?
But what?
How?
I would argue that like our argument that we're talking about is that independence doesn't just like
Yeah, I
happen
know what your
right away.
argument is. I'm asking
No,
why or
Ishan,
how.
I know what your BBC evidence says. It says that once
Yeah.
Catalonia gets independent, and then once
No,
you
it
join the
doesn't even
EU,
talk about that. It's an
takes
analysis
10
of
years.
previous EU. You're mixing up my BBC.
No, wait.
But I'm asking.
Ishan,
No. Can you just
Ishan,
answer?
I've literally
How would
read
they
this
do it
because I read
immediately?
this on the other
Yo,
side too.
how would they do this immediately?
Ishan.
No, you don't read this card because you're talking about Catalonia.
Ishan, you don't even know what my bad case is. Either way, here's my argument. I'm
Yeah.
saying that any sort of secession process will be incredibly gradual in which your impacts do not happen, and I'm just going to bring this up in rebuttal too.
Wait,
You asked me
what? A gradual independence would lead to my impacts.
Why?
Because that would leave that Catalonia is in an influx of an economic failure for 10 years.
No, they're not. I'm saying that Spain stays
I would
with
say
them.
they would be. Like, what's the
Why?
point of this?
Why?
Can you answer my question?
What is your question?
How would they immediately
I
join the
asked you
EU?
to ask a
How would
question.
they immediately join the EU?
What?
Like, how does that happen? Like, what's the
I'm
process
saying that
for
the
them
EU
to
acts
just
as
go
like a
in?
mediator in the conflict, right? Like the Betancourt evidence that I read you.
Wait, so
bottom
if
of my
you can
case
give me
tells
evidence saying that the
rights are
EU
maintained.
wants Catalonia inside the EU right now, then I'll consider that.
I would argue that it's beneficial for the EU.
Alright, just show me
to
that
have
evidence after
Catalonia
class.
in
Show me
there.
that
The
evidence
Betancourt
after
evidence
class.
says that
Okay,
pretty explicitly.
sure, just show me
Can
that,
I-
alright? Can I have another question?
Wait, you just asked me.
Alright.
Alright, it's my
I
turn.
asked.
It's my turn. Alright, let's talk about your last contention about like fracturing,
Yeah.
right? Why can't a different movement that you say exists right now do the same thing?
Because they don't have precedent to do it. Like Spain has
Why?
never. Oh yeah, this is perfect. Because sorry, there's been clearly drawn lines in Spain's constitution to never allow this to happen. But showing that Spain is willing to take the move to break those clearly
Sure.
drawn lines creates a new precedent
But
that has
these
never
other
existed
movements
before.
have the will to be independent right now, or to cause like the problems that you talk about right now.
Only
correct?
because of Catalonia. They didn't have that,
What?
and those movements were dying down. The Basque movement was dying down. They signed a ceasefire in 2010. But specifically, the leader of the Basque National Party said the resurfacing of Catalonia has
How big
inspired.
is like the Basque movement right now?
Pretty big.
Not really.
They still have control over the entire
also talk
territory.
about it in rebuttal.
Can you
Okay.
talk about it now?
What?
Can you talk about it
Rather
now?
Anshul
Explain to me why I'm wrong.
Anshul sounds better saying it too.
Okay, sure. On your first contention about refugees, right?
Yeah.
So what infrastructure does Spain have right now for refugees?
I say they have like the housing like infrastructure that they need right now too. And they have these services too. Like
Oh,
our
okay.
evidence that
Sure.
I just showed to
Perfect.
tells
No,
you.
no, no, no.
Wait,
I'm good. You can have a
no,
question.
not Spain has it. Catalonia
Oh,
has
okay.
it.
My question was, what does Spain have?
What?
My question was, what does
Spain
Spain
doesn't
have right
want
now?
refugees.
What infrastructure does it have to take refugees right now?
No, Spain doesn't have the infrastructure.
Does
I'm
it have
saying
any infrastructure for refugees?
I don't know if they have it or not. That's not my
I mean,
argument.
you said they
Ishan,
they
let
took
me explain-
6%.
Ishan,
So I
let me
assume they have
explain
some.
they have some infrastructure. I'm saying Catalonia has the infrastructure
Uh-huh.
right now that literally isn't being used.
Okay, so why did Catalonia develop
It's
infrastructure
time,
if they
Ishan.
can't take
Ishan,
refugees?
it's time.
For prep, just real quick. When I said no talking, I meant not only during like prep and whatnot, but it's highly disrespectful to speak while the speaker is speaking. If I see it again, you'll be out of the room by the end of the speech.
Can I take right down?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Oh, can I see that evidence?
Which one?
That you wanted to join immediately.
Oh, okay.
If you're prepping, that's fine. I just need to see it before you guys just rebuttal.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So I'm just going to be going straight down line in this case, as soon as everyone's ready. Let's begin. Let's start with my opponent's first contention about hurting Spain's economy. Their first warning is about tax revenue. One response here, recognized as very non-unique. Catalonia will manage its own taxes in either world. The Guardian explains that Spain is granting tax autonomy to Catalonia because they want to appease the secessionists. At that point, it's happening in both worlds. Let's go to their second warning about investment. Couple responses here. Number one, we outweigh on time frame. What Minder of the New York Times finds is that economic harms are short-term because both economies are going to eventually adjust to any economic changes. That's why Reuters finds that the Spanish economy has consistently been resilient in the face of economic harms. And that's why historically the CEPR finds that peaceful secession attempts lead to no noticeable long-term economic impacts. But third of all, Catalonia would accommodate the economic harms wrought by the split. Griffiths of U Sydney writes that the most likely scenario involving Catalonian independence is one where Spain grants Catalonia independence in exchange for Catalonia taking a share of the Spanish debt, but finally recognize that granting Catalonia independence would be better for Spain in the long run. According to economist Oriol Martinez, losing the cash cow of Catalonia would force Spain to confront the political and economic reforms the country so badly needs, like public debt, infrastructure, and investment. This turn outweighs my opponent's argument about the Catalan economy because only the AF team actually risks creating long-term structural changes to the Spanish economy, especially at the point where the Spanish economy has relapsed back into economic crisis time and time again. We need a structural long-term solution. Let's go to their contention too about freezing Ochre. Basically, it's about international isolation and how Catalonia won't be accepted into the EU. They give you two reasons why it's not going to be accepted. The first one is about a unanimous vote. But what Ishan really explicitly concedes in First Crossfire is that Spain is always going to do things to ensure that the independence and the secession of Catalonia is mutually beneficial. That's really important because what Gaurav tells you in Crossfire is that if Catalonia secedes and is not made a member of the EU, if Spain doesn't vote for them, then it's going to devastate their own economy. That's really important because that means Spain is going to vote to keep Catalonia in the EU. Their second warning is about how they don't want to set a precedent. I would say it only creates a good precedent. If the EU mediates secession, it creates a legal precedent for legal channels to be used for for secession movements across the European Union in the future. That's a lot more preferable to non-mainstream violent forms of protest and violent forms of secession. The EU probably wants to set that precedent. Now, a couple of reasons why it's actually going to enter the EU. The first is that their evidence is biased. Their evidence that they read about Catalonia being excluded doesn't account for Spanish recognition of Catalan independence. It assumes that Catalonia would be declared unauthorized independence without Spanish consent. That's not what the resolution is talking about. But second, you can delink it because the only realistic scenario in which Spain would grant Catalonia independence would be one in which it is included in the EU. In a game theory analysis of potential independence scenarios, Griffiths of University of Sydney concludes that the most likely way that Spain would grant independence would be an agreement in which Catalonia is given EU membership in exchange for taking on its share of the Spanish debt. This is the most likely scenario because the EU has an economic interest in diverting a Spanish economic crisis. But then they impact here to a failed Catalonian economy. Recognize McCrae of the Independent explains in October that any harms to Catalonia would be inherently short-term, but in the long-term it would be a very successful economy. That's why historically the CPR finds that peaceful secession attempts don't lead to noticeable economic harms. And that's why Nagel of the ANU finds that an independent Catalonia would likely be very stable and economically successful. Let's go to the third contention about other secessionist movements. First of all, it's very non-unique. There's no reason why Catalonian independence uniquely legitimized secession. Two warrants here. A, there have been plenty of successful movements in the past, like Kosovo, for example, but B, it would have been triggered by the Catalan referendum. Second of all, you can delink this argument because according to Forsberg of Uppsala University, a domino effect of secession is very unlikely to occur. A, because it doesn't change the expected probability of success for other secession movements across Europe, but B, because these other secession movements are inherently motivated by very nationalist beliefs that they should be their own independent state. Other movements being successful doesn't change their decision calculus. But third, you can turn it against them because independence movements are relatively strong in both worlds, but the AF is the only team that prevents them from escalating to violence. Kingsley of the New York Times explains, the lack of a viable solution to the Catalan crisis will embolden radical separatists in other countries who believe that peaceful negotiations are fruitless. Only the AF restores faith in the negotiation process as a good way to resolve secession conflicts. That's why Mounciani of the University of Bologna finds that if secession is subject to legal jurisdiction, it loses evocative power, becomes nonviolent.
Everyone ready? The order is going to be our case and then their case. Time starts now. On contention one, we concede their defense on our first warrant about taxes. On our second warrant, we concede the card which says that secession does not cause a long-term impact for the country that's being seceded from. So Spain is going to be the same in either way. Their argument about reforms is not a turn because they're losing a net $16 billion in tax revenue and you need money to invest in reforms, so on that, there's less of an ability to diversify. On contention two, we're going for this. We agree that in their world, Spain may be on board, but other European countries will not. They say that the EU will mediate secession because they want a legal channel for independence. I say no, because there was an illegal referendum, right? And so if you create a legal channel after an illegal referendum, if you grant them status and you say you can illegally secede, at the end of the day, Spain will get on board, the EU will get on board. What you're saying is that you can become independent against our wishes and you'll end out okay. Instead, they would say no because they want their economy to suffer, they want them to crumble, so countries like France can say, if you secede, you're going to crumble too. That's why we tell you that every single EU country is going to be against it. It's a unanimous vote. Any one country is enough to block EU membership. That's critical because we say that they lose 2/3 of their exports, 70% of investment, and it doubles employment on impact. They say that in the long term they're going to be good, but you can call for their cards. Every single one of them says that it relies on them joining the EU. More importantly, this logically doesn't make sense because Catalonia does not have a central bank, they're in debt, and they can't borrow from the EU, so there's no way for them to rebuild their economy when they're in a recession. This is going to be an extended period of time of poverty. That's the post-analysis saying that you plunge the entire country into impoverishment. Then on contention 3, they put a lot of defense on it, sure. Go to their contention 1 about refugees. First, the local in 2016 explains that actually Spain took a ton of refugees in 2016, 16,000, 6 times more than they were projected to. The only reason they didn't in 2017 is because they were cash-strapped for resources and believed that they didn't have the infrastructure to support them in 2017. They likely will return to doing so afterwards because their government is on board with refugee resettlement. But second, the Christian Science Monitor finds that even in the time period when there wasn't support for refugee resettlement in 2017, the major group that was against it was not the government, it was the people. The people were against refugee resettlement. In fact, Rajoy, the prime minister, said he would still try to resettle 17,000. But what's important is that Al Jazeera in late 2017 finds that there's a political shift going on right now, that people are starting to get back on board with refugee resettlement. That's terminal defense on the argument. But then, a couple of problems with Catalonia taking refugees. The first of which is that an independent Catalonia does not have infrastructure. Water and electricity is centralized in Madrid. They don't have a central bank, they don't have borders, they don't have a police force that has enough funding on its own. How are they going to support these refugees? Maybe they have infrastructure now, but they certainly won't once they succeed. Second problem with it is their only card is just one person from the independence movement saying, quote, we will be a country open to all. A, that is not guaranteed probability that Catalonia becomes a refugee safe haven, and B, and more importantly, I would say that in their own card it concedes that the reason he said this was to gain a political advantage and get a boost in the polls because the Catalan people may support refugee resettlement, but if it's not feasible, it's not happening. But then, a couple of turns on this argument. The first of which is that, well, Spain might be in for support of refugees right now. If you pull away one of the most liberal states, which holds liberal seats in Spain's federal parliament, that means that there's going to be a conservative push in Spain, which will decrease support for refugee resettlement in Spain. Second is that because Catalonia provides a huge amount of money through Spain, if you remove that money that's going into Spain, the EURF finds that you're decreasing the overall amount of funding that's going into the EU refugee fund, and that fund is what funds infrastructure and resettlement. Finally, you can turn it again because in Eurozone crisis and a Catalan crisis means nobody can resettle anyone. Then, on contention 2, I would say that compromise is going to happen right now, because according to The Guardian, in November 27, 2017, only 21% of Catalans currently support independence, 74% want internal reform and want to stay in Spain. That's critical. In response to our first warrant, they read a card talking about financial sector reforms that are happening right now. Importantly, The Economist explains that these reforms are a joyous way of preventing a secession by getting the people on board for a compromise, and the ING Group, a global risk analysis firm, finds that there is an 85% chance that there is no secession, that the conflict dies down, and that it's resolved through these financial reforms. Then on their warrant one about radical parties, if you lose these liberal seats, that's pushing them more towards radical parties. Also, by inspiring more secession in Spain, like the Basque movement, which is something we can still extend, we say that that increases radicalism. Finally, on violence, again, cross-applied de-escalation. Their arguments about the EU only rely on Spain's support, not the EU support. They cannot fiat the entire European Union's actions.
Oh wait, really quickly, can we see the first card on our case, like Spain? Like,
So 16,000 in 2016.
Yeah,
cash.
sorry.
Yep. This is the card. It's literally just 16,000, and the last sentence says that the reason they're not taking more is because there's not capacity. Just scroll to the bottom and highlight it.
yeah, that's fine.
And we'll continue on.
Yeah.
Alright, what else?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, you got first question.
Okay, so when you affirm the resolution and Spain grants Catalonia independence, like, what do you think that would look like? Would there be a referendum before that? Like, how do you think that after world plays out?
They would just grant it. I would say that if you run that Spain first does a bunch of other things and then grants it, then you're going beyond what
No,
the
no.
fiat is you're granting.
I'm just saying, like,
you can
in-
talk about
no,
things
no,
they
that's
would
not-
likely do after they
No,
grant
I'm asking,
independence,
like,
but at that
I
point
think,
Catalonia is out in the
shouldn't
open.
we evaluate like the most realistic world in which the resolution plays out? The most
Sure,
realistic
realistic
outcome.
so long as it's resolutional. If
Okay.
you're going outside the resolution,
That's
then we're debating something else, right?
Yeah.
Then we should change the resolution. Okay, so can I have a question?
Yeah.
So on our argument about the EU, you say that if the EU allows them to join, they're creating a precedent for legal secessions that are much less violent, right?
Sure.
Okay, so I want to understand, is this a binary between legal secessions and no secession,
Right.
or legal and illegal secession?
So I mean, like the
There's
argument.
a big difference.
I'm confused what you're asking.
Okay,
the
right.
argument is very clearly that if Spain is granting Catalonia independence, that is inherently a legal process. Spain isn't allowing
That's
them
cool,
to,
that's cool.
as opposed to unauthorized a declaration
That's
of
totally
independence,
fine.
which Spain
Okay.
has to accept.
So, couple of things. For the EU, right? Probably in their order of priorities would be number 1, no secession. Number 2, a lot lower, legal secessions. And then number 3 would be these like violent secessions that you talk about being really bad, right? But ideally they want no secession, right?
I mean, like
The
I
EU
think like EU's first and like foremost priority is preventing violent secession
Okay,
from
wait.
erupting across Europe.
I just said in terms of what's best for them is no secession, right? EU, yes.
What I would
Just
argue.
a yes or no. It's
Okay.
best for them to have no secession.
But them not playing a role in this does not guarantee that people aren't going to
No.
declare unauthorized secession in the future.
Tell me this, right?
So here's
if the EU can demonstrate a country being economically destroyed after seceding,
Yeah.
wouldn't that go a long way towards deterring future secessions?
I don't think so. I mean,
Why
like,
not?
historically, when other countries have declared secession, Kosovo, for example,
Yeah.
other like secession movements have come up after that,
Wait.
and they haven't looked at that precedent as something
You
devastating.
responded to that argument in response to our contention 3 by saying
No,
that
I'm just
it
saying-
doesn't create a precedent for it.
No, that's
And the reason is probably
we're
because
talking about
international
different things.
organizations try to
No.
kill that precedent. Like, we're fine conceding defense to contention 3,
I'm not
but that
talking about
relies on the
defense to
EU
contention three.
blocking that.
All I'm saying is that historically, secession movements don't look at like past secession movements and say like, okay, that was like they got economically destroyed or it wasn't that great for their economy in the short term.
First of
so
all-
we're not going to secede at all.
First of
all
all-
my argument, can I just clarify this
Yeah.
really quickly? All my argument about the EU is saying is that when the EU is a mediator and allows this legal process
Yeah,
by which
yeah.
Catalonia achieves independence, that sets the stage for future secession
Okay.
movements
Here,
to be mediated
Ancho,
by the
really
EU
quickly.
and prevent them from going into
Here's the
non-mainstream
contradiction,
violent
right?
politics.
Contradiction. Either A, future secession movements will look back at this as an example. If so, the EU wants Catalonia to look really bad. Or B, they won't
No.
look back at it as an example, in which case the EU has no incentive to do
No, no, no.
anything in either world.
No, or
But
they just
obviously-
secede aggressively and violently like
No,
they're doing in the status quo.
they're
That's
compromising
what we're
right
telling
now.
you.
They're compromising
Yeah,
right
but
now.
I'm not talking about just Catalonia. I'm talking about secession movements across
Yeah,
Europe.
but
And the
what's a
precedent
better
that
example
the EU
for the
acting as a
EU?
mediator sets.
No, okay.
We're on prep starting now.
Alright, is everyone ready? I'm gonna start on refugees and then I'll go to their case. Time starts. The way you vote for us is off of our first contention on refugees. So we tell you with the Wilson evidence that 17,000 refugees were supposed to be relocated to Spain, but only 6% were accepted. The reason for this comes from Hoffman, who tells you that political resistance has prevented Spain from taking in more refugees, which is bad because Spain is the only actor legally capable of taking in refugees, so Catalonia can't do it by themselves. They make a couple responses on the link level. They try to say that Spain already took in 16,000 refugees. We call for the evidence. It literally says that there were 16,000 people who went for asylum. That's literally our argument. We're saying that these refugees are applying for asylum, but they're not getting it and they're not being able to come to Spain or come to Catalonia in the first place. But then he tries to say that Catalonia does not have the infrastructure to do so. We say, A, the secession is gradual, meaning that they keep things like electricity. But secondly, the Alma Torre evidence tells you that Catalonia literally has the infrastructure for refugees right now. That's why the Palmer evidence tells you that the Catalan government is ready to take refugees, and the Belzoar evidence tells you that there's a consensus among the people that the government should be taking more refugees. He tries to turn this in a couple ways. One, he says that pulling away a liberal state decreases support for refugees coming to Spain. Realize that I would argue that it literally doesn't matter insofar as Spain is literally just not accepting refugees right now. I would say they would go somewhere to Catalonia instead. But secondly, he tries to say that you decrease funding going towards the EU for refugees as a whole. We would argue that they agree to our defense on their first contention that Spain's economy is not going to get hurt, meaning that Spain can still fund these EU initiatives as well. Here's the impact. We give you Maelstrom. Just that resettlement is literally the difference between life and death for these refugees. Two ways you weigh this. Number one is magnitude, because refugees suffer a lot more than the richer people in Catalonia would suffer if there was an economic downturn. But number two is probability, because they can't necessarily prove to you that a recession would happen, but we give you a guarantee that these 17,000 refugees are actually going to get a home in Catalonia. But now, let's go to one quick turn on their case, which is going to be off of their third contention, which they don't respond to. They concede to the defense defense, but they also don't respond to the turn. But we give you the Manciani evidence, which is the last response in Octos' rebuttal. He tells you that creating legal jurisdiction loses the evocative power of independence movements and prevents them from going towards something like violence. They say that like these movements already exist right now. We say give them a legal means, stop violence.
Stop. Cut now.
That was 130.
And use that against refugees.
Starts with our case. Everybody ready? Bonus?
Yeah.
Good.
Yep.
On our second contention, they don't respond to the fundamental warrant. The warrant is that if France has secessionary movements inside its own countries, when it sees a vote inside the EU, it does not want to encourage its own countries to have the precedent that they can secede and then join. It's not about secessionist movements and whether or not they exist. It's about countries not wanting the secessionist movements. Because of that, France or someone would veto it, and because of that, you cleanly extend the analysis that they're not in the EU. That's the first warrant that you can cleanly extend. The second part is the EU warrant, and that in general they won't allow it. This is because the EU is not deciding between secessionism and peaceful and violent secessionism. They just don't want secessionalism in the first place. That's the fundamental warrant that they don't understand. Because of this, the EU as a whole wouldn't even consider the application of Catalonia, but even if it gets through, somebody like France would reject it. With this in mind, you vote right now, because this means if Catalonia is in an economic recession, which we would say immediately happens, then they can't support any infrastructure for refugees because they have to focus on their own people, and they simply do not have the capacity to take in these refugees. This is a complete offense. You can send your bow right now. But more specifically, on our third condition, they extend some turn about how decreased violent secessions. They see themselves that people don't look at historical secessions, so it really doesn't matter. More specifically on their case, you're extending a couple things. The first thing that you extend on refugees is the Al Jazeera evidence saying that the political tides are turning right now in Spain. This does a couple things. First, it's on terminal defense on their entire case. They get no options. Second, it grants us lead to our turn, which they say doesn't matter because the political tides are the same. What this means is that when you leave liberal states, Spain accepts even less refugees, so we went off of their argument. But more specifically on their second contention, this is another independent voter, even if you don't believe anything I said. Because right now, a neg world includes compromises like they listed in response to our contention one, which is why I conceded it. The ING analysis tells you that there's an 85% chance the reform will solve for conflict inside the region. When you solve for this conflict, that is how you help create a more stabilized economy and you accept more refugees, linking into their first contention. The second thing you're going to extend is the analysis that Devesh gives you from about bats. What it tells you is that with our third contention, the part that they don't respond to is that Spain can filter, not just the EU. If Spain splinters, that means countries like the Basque movement will be inspired directly because of Catalonia. When that happens, you turn and you increase the amount of conflict, which can destabilize the region. Political turmoil means you can have an infrastructure to accept refugees. Thus, mitigate.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start.
Yeah. That first question.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this like Al Jazeera evidence about like why like people in Spain don't support refugees.
Why didn't you talk about it in the summary?
What? Because I don't think it matters.
Okay, sure.
Really?
Just ask
Okay.
a question.
Why does it matter?
It's okay.
my
So
question.
we said that the only reason they didn't take refugees in 2017, we have two reasons.
A is that they were resource strapped because in 2016
And they didn't take them in
took
2016
16,000.
either, Devash.
Wait, the card
Your
says,
evidence says that they
card says-
applied for
okay,
asylum.
if you're going to
and
read
didn't
that
get it.
evidence, then be
Yeah.
prepared for us to read its title because it literally says that Spain took 6 times more refugees
Look,
than
literally
years
read
prior.
like the
See, that was-
overview on
see,
it.
that's
too.
like a pretty
welcomed more
misleading
refugees
title.
than
And
And
the
literally
reason-
the last sentence of the article that we point out to you says the only reason they didn't
Why are you
take
touching
more.
my partner?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's fine. You know each other.
Okay,
Like,
it says that of those 16, at the time when this article was written, it said of those 16,000 who applied, 7,000 have already been granted asylum, and 4,000 are having their applications pending before they get asylum.
So
that's certainly
the
more than
exact-
6%.
That's the problem, right? Like the Wilson evidence that we read at the top of our case is literally accounting for that. It's talking about those granted asylums and it's talking about those applications that were received for asylum. And it said that yes, Spain did all of that, but it didn't actually resettle them. It said yes, we are going to grant 17,000 refugees asylum, but it only granted 1,000 of them. At that point,
wait.
like the
It
Wilson
only
evidence is
granted
talking about the same
1,000.
refugees you're talking about.
Wait. Let's talk about
Same
how we're
group of
wording this.
refugees, yeah.
How are we wording this? You say 1,000 were granted asylum,
He
right?
said 6% of those 17,000 were there.
Is there a difference between asylum and resettlements?
Yes, very big
What's the
difference.
difference?
Asylum is when they accept your application and they say, yes, we will grant you asylum. Resettlement is when you actually take them from that refugee camp and into that host nation.
So
And
your
that's what we're
card
saying
says,
has not happened
your
at all.
card says that they took 17,000 for asylum, but then didn't resettle them.
It said 17,000 were supposed to be relocated.
That's exactly
only
what
6
we're saying.
were
And
done.
what
Like
year was
yours-
that? What year was that in?
That's 2017.
2017.
The
Because
evidence
I'm
is from
pretty-
2017. It's talking about the 2016.
This is six
Wait, but
Pledge.
the target for 2017 and 16 was different, right?
It's
It was
talking about-
16K and then 17K.
It
talking
went
about
up
the
to
year after.
17K for 2017. It was 16K
Yeah.
with your evidence, which is
Yeah.
2016.
No, that's our
No,
point.
okay.
Because in 2016 we were able to do
No.
it, but in 2017 Spain was
No,
cash strapped, so they
it's talking
didn't.
about that same pledge, and it said that Spain did not follow through with that pledge. But we've
Yeah,
been
it's
talking
talking
about
about
this
for
for
17
This is
This
going
is
on.
for
Can I just ask you a
16.
quick question?
Go for it.
Your evidence about Catalonia taking refugees relies on Catalonia, like the current situation that Catalonia is in, right?
What?
It relies on the current situation that Catalonia is in. Right now they have great infrastructure. Right now they can support lots of refugees.
No,
Right?
I mean, like, not necessarily. Like, the Hoffman evidence or, like, the Tasman evidence say that given independence, the Catalonia independent state
So,
would still take
just
in
question.
refugees.
Can you
Like,
name
it's
one?
talking-
Can you name one country that's gone through an intense economic recession, had unemployment double on impact, and lose 70% of its investment
yeah.
that has resettled refugees?
Yeah, like Germany, Turkey had big economic crises, and they still talk
And to
still
that
took
degree,
refugees.
a small
Yeah,
state,
it's like
a
foreign
small
aid,
state that
two-thirds
collapses
are-
inwards that has taken refugees.
They had economic downturns, and they had and
I
and
mean-
they still
Yeah, but
took
wait,
refugees.
side
Like,
Devash, more importantly, we would argue that even if Catalonia doesn't join the EU, Spain has an active incentive to make sure that Catalonia does not collapse. Even if they don't join the EU, I would argue that Spain's probably still going to step in no matter what. That's probably more probable.
Okay, I mean,
Probably.
you don't prove how they
In
think.
3 minutes.
Yeah.
Is everyone ready? I'm going to be starting on refugees, and then I'll go to my opponent's case. Yeah. Everyone ready? Let's start on refugees. They give you a couple of responses in summary. Don't let Devesh extend any other responses in summary. In the final focus, the first response is this idea that political tides are changing in Spain. Ogarov responds to this in summary. He says the Hoffman tells you that political resistance coming in 2017, that's where the evidence is from, has prevented Spain from taking in more refugees. Total political gridlock, factionalization with the Spanish government makes it structurally so that they can't take in more refugees. That basically takes out their idea of political tides changing. But then on this idea of economic downturn being a prerequisite, a couple of problems here. First of all, I'm going to respond to this on their case. But second of all, we tell you that Catalonia already has the infrastructure necessary in order to accept these refugees. But if anything, I would say that even if economic harms are going to be bad, Catalonia is still going to take in refugees. Historically, countries like Germany and Turkey have done that in the past, and the reason is pretty simple. They see refugee inflows as a critical source of economic growth and a really good way to, for example, plug the labor gap, so they're just going to take even more refugees in. With that in mind, we're winning refugees. The Hoffman evidence says that the only way that Spain has the final word on accepting refugees, Catalonia can't do it by itself. The only solution is granting Catalonian independence. What we tell you from Palmer and from Belware that Catalonian government is ready to take refugees as soon as they are made independent. The impact here is preventing mass suffering. What we tell you from Maelstrom is that resettlement is the fundamental difference between life and death for these refugees. They try to tell you that Spain took 16,000 in 2016. That's not what their evidence is actually talking about. What we tell you in 2017 from Wilson post-dating their analysis and talking about the same pledges that they're talking about is that Spain has actually only come through with 5% of its actual pledge. It isn't taking in these refugees. We need Catalonia to do so. You weigh this in a couple of ways. First is probability. The probability of their economic collapse impacts and EU collapse are very, very low. We tell you there's a 100% probability that we allow each of these 17,000 refugees to finally find a home. But then let's go to their case. This is really important because we extended a couple of responses that Ishan just does not interact with in summary. The first is from the CPR, which says that peaceful secession historically does not lead to economic downturns. For example, Kosovo didn't enter the EU, it still didn't see economic downturn. But second of all, we tell you that Spain always has the incentive to see that Catalonians' economy is okay too. They don't respond to that.
Yeah. Everyone ready? Alright, it's gonna go refugees, econ. Okay, let's start time now. First, on the question of whether Spain is going to resettle refugees in the negative world. I looked back at my card. It literally says, quote, the resettled refugees arrived in Spain. I'm pretty clear, if you ask for the evidence, it says that the only reason they didn't take them in 2017 is they were short on resources, it would resume. But second, even if you do not buy that, right, if you buy that the government was against refugees before, what Al Jazeera says is that moving forward support is increasing because there's been an economic bounce back and now they can support it. And so they just say that no, it's still gridlocked. I guarantee you our evidence post-dates theirs. This means that there was like a high probability that Spain is going to take refugees. But there are two ways that you compromise this when you vote for them. The first way is that you're removing the liberal seats from Spain. Remember, that was the term that Ishan extended. This is the only way that you have support for refugee resettlement. I would argue it's much better to have a large state with full infrastructure taking refugees than to have a small state that can't support itself. But B is that you collapse the economy of Catalonia. I would argue that when you have a long-term recession that spans 10 years with a doubling of unemployment and 2/3 of exports being lost, you're not going to be able to support it. They say it's happened in the past with like some countries like Turkey and Germany, but they definitely were not collapsing inwards. They were like, oh, it will fill the labor gap. But it's an inverse labor gap, right? Because you have tons of people but no jobs to employ them. When you double unemployment, why would they want more people who want jobs when they have no jobs to support them in the first place? They're not going to take refugees if there's an econ downturn. Then they go to the EU argument. There are a couple of things they extend. The first thing they say is that there's no long-term impact, just a generic study. But for our empirical analysis specific to Spain and the political conditions and the projections we have, it's just better evidence. Second thing they say is, well, Spain's going to do whatever they can, but Spain can't influence every other European country. They have not responded to the EU link in summary or final focus, which means it flows clean through. The argument here is that the European Union and their member states do not want to encourage secession, because if you have an illegal referendum and then you legally get back into the EU and you're doing just fine, then what they're saying is that anybody can start to secede and everyone will turn out okay. By contrast, if they deny them, then they can say that failure is an example of why you shouldn't secede. That's important because, again, we tell you it leads to a long-term recession. Post tells you it's an extended period of poverty. They don't have money and they're already in debt, which means they can't even get out of this recession. So at the end of the day, you're collapsing their economy and you can't help refugees.
Only because you told me it's a guarantee, could I get the date on your Al Jazeera evidence, and then I'll need the comparative date from whatever app evidence